Hello everyone, this is Mateusz Kołosowski. We are continuing Rook versus Pawn endgames, and I hope you still remember what those previous parts were about. Basically, it's really important for the stronger side to try to separate the king and the pawn of the weaker side, and of course join the battle for the pawn with the king, because it's practically impossible to win just with the rook. And generally piece coordination is something really important, and this piece coordination problem is what I would actually like to start with in this first diagram, as this position is very interesting, and there's only one way for white to win this. It's a strange situation because, as you can see, the rook is badly placed. It's placed in front of the pawn. I'm not sure if you know that, but according to theory and also according to practice, the best position for the rook is generally behind the pawn. Second best position is next to the pawn, and then the worst position is in front of the pawn. It's connected with the scope of the rook. Once the pawn progresses, the scope of the rook behind the pawn increases, and the scope of the rook in front of the pawn just gets smaller. In this case, apart from the problem with the rook, the king is also, well, not so far away from the pawn, but as you can see, black is threatening to gain a tempo with a move like king f3, and then e3 will follow. So even though the white king is pretty close to the black pawn, it's not close enough. And the most direct attempt to win this endgame by playing king e5, for instance, is not effective, because king f3 gains a tempo on the rook, rook h2, e3, king d4, then just e2, and rook h1 is forced, king f2, black is going to promote. So rook h3 check, king f2 is the only move, king f4, e2, rook h2, king f1, this is forced, everything is was forced. And here it looks like white cannot prevent promotion, but at the same time he can create a checkmate threat by king f3, and once it seems that white is winning, or at least for some of the players, it may seem that white is winning, because if the black player promotes to a queen, then rook h1 is checkmate, but black can play e1 knight, under promote the pawn, and this in fact is a draw. As I mentioned in the previous example, the final example of the second part of Rook versus Pawn endgames, Rook versus Knight endgames are drawish unless the knight gets promoted in the corner of the board, so when we are dealing with rank pawns, A and H pawns. So this in fact is a draw. For this reason, white should avoid playing king e5, king f5. This would all lead to the same thing. And instead, white manages to find a brilliant idea. The point is to transfer the rook to be placed behind the pawn. As I told you, such a position is the best, and then reacting to black's next move with a proper move made by the king. So white starts with rook g5, attempting to place the rook behind the pawn. Of course, rook g8 would not make any sense, because okay, this rook will be placed behind the pawn, but it will also be blocked by the white king, so white doesn't want that. And here black has a couple of moves. He can play king f3, king d3, king d2, king f2, but there are actually only two moves with a separate value, king d3 and king f3. or king d2 and king f2, these will lead to the same thing. So it's either going left or right. If king f3, then a direct attempt to winning with playing king d5, e3, king d4, e2 would also result in a draw, but white can start gaining a tempo with rook f5, and this is once again another very important technique you should be aware of. Sometimes you can just give a check to force the king of the weaker side to for its position to be determined simply. So if king g2, then white goes rook e5 and finally places the rook on the desired position. If king e3, then the king is blocking the pawn, it's preventing it from the further movement. And if king e2, king e5, e3, king e4, and this is quite a peculiar situation when black actually cannot make any progress, because if king d2, then rook d5, and once again the king is tied down to the pawn, king e2, rook d3 wins. Very nice idea, and everything gets pretty much simple once you play rook g5, and you, of course, provided that you know that you need to start with a check, and only after the check place the rook behind the pawn. So the other move apart from king f3 could be king d3, but if you've been following my mini lecture on how to play those positions, then you should probably know that rook d5 is the right move. King c2 or king e2 will lead to the same thing. King c2, for instance, rook e5, king d3, and here not king d5, because then e3 and the white king is actually self-shouldered, so to speak, because then the king on d3 creates this artificial barrier once again. But king f5 is important. It's still a good position for the king, and it's just attacking the pawn, so it needs to be good. e3 is forced, king f4, e2, and king f3, and this wins by force. So for the stronger side, you should already be aware of three ideas that should guarantee you a success in rook versus pawn endgames. First of all, try to separate the king from the pawn. This is the most effective way. If this can be done, then nothing will prevent you from winning. Of course, this must be used effectively. This can not always be applied. So for this reason, you need to know that the rook is pretty much helpless against a well-positioned king and an advanced pawn. For this reason, you need to use a king. And once you manage to join, coordinate the king and your rook, well, then the stronger side doesn't have that much of a chance to survive. And the third thing is that you should remember is actually connected with gaining tempi and winning precious time, because as you probably realized, every single tempo counts, and the margin between lost and won or drawn positions is very, very small. So it's good to be able to gain tempi on the king by playing those intermediate moves that are connected with checks. Okay, so let's move on. Let's take a look at a position that is placed on the diagram. Of course, apart from those techniques that white can use, you still need to know how to draw positions that are theoretically drawn. And here it looks like white has a pretty good chance of winning, because as you probably remember, when the pawn gets promoted to a knight in the corner, this is winning for the stronger side. And here you should probably already be able to imagine a scenario where white plays rook h2, forces black to go to b1 or any, b1 basically. Then king b3, threatens checkmate. We've been dealing with that idea. And if queen, then rook h1 checkmate. If knight, then king c3, then the knight cannot escape from the corner of the board. And it is white to move. Rook h2 is played. So, being black, instead of resigning, you should be aware of this idea that it's actually the only idea that can save this position. And it does save this position. As we have already calculated briefly, king b1 loses, king a1 doesn't make any sense, king c1 just drops the pawn, so the only move, even when you try to eliminate the wrong alternatives, is king a3. And this surprisingly, well, this may be counterintuitive in a sense, but at the same time, if you still remember the whole idea of shouldering, which is basically the most effective, if not the only idea that gives the weaker side reasonable drawing chances. If you still remember the shouldering idea, then this move is reasonably easy to find, because it's the only move that prevents the white king from making progress. So if king b3 is not allowed, then it means that the rook on h2 needs to prevent the pawn from getting promoted on its own. So rook h1 or rook h3, king b2, rook h2 of course leads to the same thing, so king a3. Rook h1 doesn't make any difference, because once again black goes king b2. So the only try is king b4, but then just queen, rook h2, king b1. And king b3, even though it looks pretty strong, is actually losing because of queen a8. And this is the only square for the queen to control this h1 square, but at the same time it's enough to reach queen versus rook endgame, which is winning. So please be careful not to make a mistake like that. Once again, every single tempo counts. So if white was to move, before black queens the pawn, this would be winning, but since it's black to move after king b3, then black can just play queen a8. So here the only move to keep the draw is rook h1, but it does make a draw. I would also like to point out a position from actual practice. This is a position taken from a pretty old game, but at the same time I could not really find any stronger player who made a mistake like that. This is a position taken from a classical game played between the former world champion Alexander Alekhine and Efim Bogolyubov from 1929, from one of the elite tournaments. And even though both of the players were extremely strong grandmasters, well, especially Alekhine, obviously because he was the world champion, but also Efim Bogolyubov was a very, very good player, absolute top of chess players of that time. And here, even though he was such a good player, maybe his endgame skills were not that good, and he went for king g4. Of course, we can imagine a scenario where black is forced to sacrifice the rook for the pawn on b6, and after king g4, this is what happens: b7, f5, b8 queen. Of course, playing rook b8 here doesn't make that much of a difference because king c7 follows. So this continuation was played. f4, king d5, simply f3, king e4, f2, and white won in the following way. Very surprising for a grandmaster, strong grandmaster such as Efim Bogolyubov. And let's go back to the initial position. Here, if you still remember what shouldering is about, then you should automatically make a move like king e4, not allowing the white king to be improved once the rook on d8 gets exchanged for the pawn on b6. If the white king is prevented from getting improved, then there is basically no hope for white to win this position whatsoever. So b7, f5, queen, rook takes, f4. Once again, there's this artificial barrier. F4, king c5, f3, rook f8, king e3, king c4, f2. Once again, the barrier. King c3, king e2. Once again, there is the barrier. Rook e8, and not king f1. King f3 is good. Basically, don't block your pawn, and this should be fine. King d1 is enough to make a draw. So the conclusion is that even though it's pretty basic knowledge, relatively basic knowledge, and well, definitely basic knowledge for a grandmaster, mistakes like that and misunderstanding of rook versus pawn games occurs even at the highest level of chess. So please make sure that you don't follow the footsteps of players who don't know how to play the rook endgames, and instead just make sure that you follow the instruction and just try to understand everything in the best possible way. Please make sure you understand those techniques. There will be the next part of those rook versus pawn endgames, because I did not manage to exhaust the material in 3 parts, so there's going to be part 4. Please stay tuned, and I hope you enjoyed it. This has been Mateusz Kołosowski for Mind Sports Academy.